Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly program where we discuss the week's world news. Joining us this week is Carla Robbins, who is a adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, the faculty director at Baruch College's Marx School of Public and International Affairs, and a former journalist with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Carla, wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Ivo.
Also joining us, Ed Luce, who is the U.S. commentator for the Financial Times. Ed, great to have you.
Great to be here, Ivo.
And Steve Erlanger, who is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Steve, wonderful for you to join us as well.
Thank you, Ivo.
Well, lots of things to talk about. Let's talk about China. Which seems to be one of the topics we talk about every week, but every week there's news. This week we saw a serious escalation as well as a big speech by the Secretary of State. Carla, what happened this week and why are we where we are today?
Well, things have gotten very nasty very, very quickly. Overnight, China ordered, as you know, the closing of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. That's after the U.S. ordered the closing of the Chinese consulate in Houston. And that's after the Trump administration changed visa rules for just thousands potentially of Chinese students in the U.S. who have relations with any Chinese military institution, keeping in mind that the PLA basically controls everything in China. This is escalating really, really fast in a really frightening way. But I think probably the scariest or most potentially explosive thing that's happened in the last week was the speech that the Secretary of State gave yesterday at the Nixon Library, in which he proclaimed, and keeping in mind that it was at the Nixon Library, that the crowning achievement of Richard Nixon's presidency was a complete failure. That there was, that we had basically been enabling the Chinese for 50 years of engagement. And I'm going to read the quote. He said, "The free world must triumph over this new tyranny," which was a pretty strong thing. So why now? That's the question that you asked, Ivo. So if you take them, meaning the administration, at their word, this is a response to a host of Chinese misdeeds. And there is no question that there are a lot of Chinese misdeeds out there. The crackdown in Hong Kong, the mishandling of the coronavirus, which the president insists on calling the China virus, and an ongoing campaign of cyber espionage, which we know to be true. I mean, Chris Wray, who is the director of the FBI, who I think is a pretty straight shooter, said in a speech this month that the agency was opening a new China-related counterintelligence operation every 10 hours, which is a pretty extraordinary stat. But if you contrast this with how the administration has not responded to Russia on cyber espionage, they've accused both the Chinese and the Russians of trying to steal vaccine information. And the fact that the president wouldn't even say anything. In fact, he said it was fake news, this fabulous New York Times report about the Russians placing bounties, to kill Russian soldiers and American soldiers in Afghanistan. It's hard to get away from the sense that this is all a prelude for the Trump political campaign, that they're going to have the new Cold War and potentially walk themselves into a new hot war in the South China Sea with China. It is a pretty frightening escalation going on right in front of our eyes.
Steve, just before Pompeo flew out to the Nixon Library, he of course was in Europe. He was in London and then in Denmark, and you had sort of a sense of a victory lap here. A Secretary of State who had tried to get the Europeans to finally start playing ball on China, had succeeded at least with the British decision to cut off Huawei's collaboration and engagement in the British 5G system. How was the reaction to Pompeo's visit and of course to his speech that he gave yesterday?
Well, the Americans are very important to Brexit Britain, first of all. And Boris Johnson still, he has to be careful with Trump. I mean, Trump loves him and he can't be too visibly loving Trump back. Boris was, I think, reluctantly agreed in the end to pull out of Huawei, but as John Soares, the former MI6 boss, said, it would have been possible to use Huawei to some degree, but once the Americans started really amping up secondary sanctions, it would have been almost impossible to do it. So it simply made no sense. The Europeans are very nervous about, being dragged into this battle with China. I mean, they see it, as Carla just said, as part of Trump's re-election campaign. They see a lot of Trump's actions on China, a decent wake-up call, but his tariffs have been basically counterproductive. Europe still does a huge amount of business with China, and China does a lot of stealing intellectual property from Europe too, and Europe's quite aware of it. So they're wary. I mean, they're not going to be equidistant between China and the United States. I mean, in political terms and value terms, they are with the United States, but they're also not going to get into Trump's lap on this. And I'm sure we'll wait to see what produces the American electorate. The speech itself, as Carla says, was very bizarre, very harsh. I mean, it even suggested that the Chinese People's Army was not there to defend the people of China, but only to defend the Communist Party of China and to expand the empire, which is a very bizarre interpretation of what China's doing. So everybody knows, China needs to be engaged, though Pompeo thinks it doesn't, on climate change, on all kinds of important issues. China's going to matter. It's not going to go away. And if Pompeo doesn't like it, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. And really, the Europeans know this. What they want is a coordinated policy, which Pompeo has begun to talk about with the Europeans, but that's not going to go anywhere until after the election.
Ed, of course, this is taking place in a political season and a political time, but at the same time, you see the administration in a series of speeches, and Pompeo's just being the last one. We had a speech by the National Security Advisor, by, as Carla said, by the FBI director, by the Attorney General, and now by the Secretary of State, to sort of lay out a broad indictment, not just of China, but of the Chinese Communist Party, as Steve reminded us. And this sense that there is this fundamental change in American policy from finding ways to cooperate to deal with issues together to a direct zero-sum kind of opposition. Is that what's driving it? And you're in Washington, to what extent is there support for that kind of sort of almost a zero-sum policy that we're embarking on?
I think it's fair to say that, as you know, there's been a very rapid sort of hardening of bipartisan consensus about China, that we're no longer in the win-win arc of history, China gradually liberalizing and moderating its stance phase, and that everybody's accepted. We're into more of a zero-sum win-lose situation with China. I think, though, the view of the administration, which since Mike Pence gave a speech almost 2 years ago, the vice president, has been giving the kinds of speeches Pompeo just gave. Pompeo sort of stepped it up a notch. But the administration is a sort of two-speed administration. There are the Mike Pences, the Mike Pompeos, the Chris Wrays, the Bill Barrs, who have a consistent uber-hawkish stance on China. And then there's the president, who, it just depends what time of day it is and what's on his mind. So we saw with the John Bolton book a few weeks ago that Trump really doesn't give a damn about what's happening in Xinjiang to the Uyghur people. It doesn't really evince much concern for the people of Hong Kong, although there have been some pro forma statements. And likewise with the India-China border, dangerous border situation, one pro forma statement. So if you're Chinese and you're trying to unravel the riddle of well, what does Trump actually believe? That all his key lieutenants are saying pretty similar things, and they're getting quite hawkish. But what does Trump himself believe? I suspect what they think is, well, he's decided the China virus, as he calls it, is the way to win the election and to shift responsibility for the handling of the pandemic. But he's probably going to lose the election. So let's go back to our earlier selves and bide our time until after November. Then we'll see what happens.
Well, I mean, one point, I mean, Ed's absolutely right that, the president has swung all over the place. And one of my favorite moments, I mean, when Xi sort of became president for life, I mean, Trump was marveling, if only that could happen for him. And in the Bolton book, he does say that he asked Xi to help him with his reelection. That said, I've certainly seen in Washington, there is the bureaucracy itself, certainly in the Pentagon in particular, from mid all the way up to the top. There is a consensus, a fundamental anti-China consensus that is there, that is not just in the political people. And that's going to be no matter who wins the election. There has been a fundamental shift in strategic thinking in Washington that China really is eating our lunch. Anything from Chinese students to ships in the South China Sea. So if Biden comes in, he's going to have to make some pretty fundamental strategic decisions when his advisors from the Pentagon certainly believe that from top to bottom.
I think that's exactly right. About a year ago, I was in the Pentagon and asked the question of top senior civilian folks. So what are your three top priorities? And the answer was China, China, and China. And I think that's very much part of how the Washington consensus has emerged and changed that both you and Ed talked about. Steve, let's move on to another big piece of news. The European Union finally, after 4 days and nights of negotiations in person with masks most of the time, leaders got to a budget agreement that may or may not turn out to be quite historic. What happened?
Well, I think it is really important. I mean, it's also in some ways historic, but I mean, Europe has been very badly hit, as everyone, by this virus. It has been divided by the virus. The economy has been cratered, and the whole idea of European Union solidarity, I mean, these countries are sharing sovereignty, so shouldn't they take care of each other, was really being called into question. And a Europe after Britain has less money, but even at 27 is very diverse between North and South, South being particularly hit by the virus, Italy, Spain, East and West, partly because of issues of rule of law in Hungary, Poland, and all this. And yet these people have to get together and agree. I mean, it's very hard to get 27 friends together and agree on anything, let alone leaders who need to go home and tell their people, see, we won, or we did well, right? So it's always a challenge, and it's always a challenge about money. And so you have these two incredibly complicated things that cleverly were put together. One was the recovery fund for the virus, and the other was the 7-year multiple-year budget, which is always very, very complicated. So this was clever, and what was historic about it, though it was probably a one-off, is that Emmanuel Macron, whose big visions about Europe are shared by almost no one, did convince Angela Merkel that this was a crisis that required a different kind of commitment by Germany. And there was this sweet spot between German national interests, which require a functioning single market and a decent economy for an export-led country, and European interests. And so she paired with Macron. They did this whole negotiation together. They were never separated. And she agreed to a large amount of grants that would be financed by collective debt. So that was a real breakthrough, a real taboo breaker. And the question, once she had agreed with Macron that that would happen, the size of Germany, her stature, the fact that the Germans have the rotating presidency, as it turns out, of this 6 months, meant that the only fight was going to be over the balance of loans and grants. I mean, the sort of frugal North that came in saying, well, we don't want any grants, that was never going to follow through. So in the end, though Macron had originally wanted €1 trillion of grants, and Merkel got him down to 500 billion euros before they even got started. And then the Commission wanted to put on 250 billion extra for loans. In the end, the balance was 390 billion for grants and 360 billion for loans. But the North did get a system of monitoring and policing of those funds because of the fear, one, that these same countries would abuse them or there'd be fraud, and two, that the Commission, which is the bureaucracy of the bloc, was too weak to actually monitor it very, very well. So everybody got something, but I think it was a really important moment for the European Union, because to fail would have been a true disaster. And then the other issue was the issue of rule of law. I mean, a lot of people are fed up with Hungary in particular, and Poland in part, and the Slovakia and the Czechs a bit too, and wanted to condition the dispersal of normal budgetary funds to those countries on their better adherence to European values and rule of law. And because consensus is required for the whole thing, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and the Polish Prime Minister pretty much dodged that, right? I mean, there was some language about it, but I don't think they're really going to be troubled by it. And Angela Merkel and others understood to hold up the whole deal for that was probably not a great idea. And one can criticize it. I mean, they cut the budget in important things that they wanted to do, like green programs and the European Defense Fund and military mobility. A lot of that got slashed away. So Parliament is unhappy. The European Parliament must approve it. There'll be big debates, but I do think it was a really important moment. It was kind of Merkel's last rodeo, and she did a good job.
Ed, thanks, Steve. That's terrific. Ed, your paper today is editorializing about particularly the loan part and the fact that the EU is taking on collective debt, and arguing that although it's seen as a one-off, may well propel the EU in a new direction, potentially with the euro becoming a reserve currency to compete ultimately with the dollar. One of the issues that many in Europe, given secondary sanctions and everything else that's going on, are looking to do. Is that a fair reading? Is that something that is not just possible but likely now to happen? Now that not only, as Steve said, we've avoided failure in Europe, but got success. Is this a new era?
It could well be. The south of Europe, led by Macron, championed by Macron, believes this isn't a one-off, that this is the beginning of what's going to become a sort of growing and building collective European debt effort and transfer between North and South, West and East. The frugal five, if you include Finland, which joined at the last minute, believe this is a one-off and it's just because of special circumstances. I would suspect the precedent will be hard to undo. And that's why I would agree very strongly with Steve that this is kind of crossing a boundary here. You've never had mutualized European debt. And now that we're going to have that, we're going to get a yield curve. It won't be the German yield curve or the Italian yield curve, that it'll be the European benchmark, the Eurozone's benchmark. And that's, of course, an essential precondition to having a serious, deep, liquid international reserve currency. There are lots of speculation about, whether the dollar will be toppled as the premier global currency. The renminbi is nowhere near challenging it. China needs all kinds of things to happen for it to pose a really serious challenge to the dollar. The Eurozone has now taken a step back to where it used to be, maybe 15 years ago, as a credible potential alternative to the dollar in the coming years. I don't think in fiscal or economic terms, what was agreed this week is very serious. It's not very important in and of itself. You know, $390 billion, euros rather, in grants is really a drop in the bucket in terms of the sort of fiscal stimulus that you've had here, which is 12% of GDP. There, it's like 3%. It's not going to change the economic. It's not going to change the economic weather in Europe. What it does do, I think, politically, is show that the Franco-German motor is back on the road again. And Europe stuff only ever happens when there's Franco-German competition cooperation, and where they fail to agree, stuff doesn't happen. So that's, to me, the most important thing. And the second most important thing is that you have this European debt instrument, and that's a serious development for the global financial picture.
Pick that up for a moment on Ed, and if you want to comment on the law and order piece with Poland and Hungary, happy to do that as well. But it seems to me that the Europeans who have been looking at the United States and China getting into this competition are looking for a way to gain leverage, to find a way for them to exert influence, and this may well be one of the ways to do it. If you have an independent reserve currency, you then are no longer as reliant on the dollar as so many European countries have been for so long, and can actually take actions without having to fear Washington's wrath. Carla?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was to Ed. Well, when the whole debate over sanctions and that we looked at for such a long time, and suddenly these, secondary sanctions and banking sanctions, and suddenly we have a new tool, and from the Iran deal on, and as Steve was saying about Huawei, the fear of getting cut out of the American banking system has certainly had the Brits jumping and everybody else jumping. I personally, now this is a little bit me driving without a license, all the years at the Wall Street Journal, nevertheless, you really don't want to take economic advice from me or financial advice from me. Nevertheless, I've been hearing for a really long time this notion that the euro is going to replace the dollar. The American banking system didn't go down in 2009, and people still want to, move through. You're not going to separate the European banks from the American banks, and so the notion that somehow you're going to be able to leverage one against the other would mean, even it's very hard to decide what is what is one the same way for a multinational anyway. One of the things that really struck me about this, and that that Stephen Ed can explain to me, is that all of the things that are happening now, Merkel absolutely refused to do during the Eurozone crisis. Wouldn't take on collective debt, didn't feel all that sympathy for the South until the very, very end itself. These are, it all had to be loans, the notion of grants. I mean, all of these things are happening. So is it because it's so much of a bigger crisis? Or is it because she's on her way out the door? Did she learn her lesson from something? This is, to me, really is fascinating, because I do think this is an incredible turning point in which it's true. When people lend now, when they put bonds out, this is suddenly, the euro is finally really a European currency at this moment, to my mind. But take that with the grain of salt, that you really never want to take economic advice from me.
Steve, you've just been thinking and writing about Merkel. You did a piece about a week ago. Take that question, which I think is excellent. Why did Merkel shift when even Obama was unable to push her into this direction, and he tried very hard back in the original Eurozone crisis? Why the shift?
Well, first of all, in the first crisis, it was Greece, and Greece was tiny, and a lot of people thought Greece should get out of the euro anyway. And she had Schäuble as her finance minister, and German public opinion was very much set against giving money away to people who've been lying about their statistics and their debts for years and years and years. This time, Italy was at risk. Now, Italy is a big country. It's the third largest economy in the European Union, right? So you can't have Italy go down the drain. Italy provides Germany a lot of trade. It makes a lot of things, you know, machine parts, etc., that Germans use. And I think what also happened is you had a different finance minister, who's Olaf Scholz from the Social Democrats, which is the more left-wing coalition partner, who'd been the mayor of Hamburg. And he and Bruno Le Maire, who's the French equivalent, who's a German speaker, kind of got together and sprung this on Merkel with Macron in the background. And I think they convinced her that Europe really was at risk. It wasn't just Greece. And actually, German public opinion was in favor of helping Italy and Spain. And I think it also helps that she, you know, was badly criticized for her delays in 2000, 8, 9, 10, the Greek crisis lasted till like 2015. She cost Europe a lot of money by her own delay. And there are people in the South of Europe who will never forgive her. So I think that really was part of it. And also there are two other things that should be said. One is the European Central Bank learned a big lesson from 2008 and immediately pushed forward at more than 350 billion euros in credit for nation states. And that kept the Italian borrowing reasonable and Spanish borrowing reasonable. And they did this right away. And also the Commission suspended its normal fiscal rules, understanding that every state was going to spend a huge amount of money this year and would have huge fiscal deficits, and Brussels was not going to care. So the French this year, which always struggle to have a fiscal deficit of, let's say, 3%, 3.5% of GDP, this year will probably be 12, 15% of GDP, but interest rates are low. So those lessons were very important. And Ed is right, the size of these grants is not so big on the European scale compared to what each state is putting out. But the principle that is now established, he's absolutely right, and Carla's right. I mean, the Macron, the French, the South are not going to, the architecture's there now for the future. The big question is, will a Merkel successor, and she will not be there much longer, have the strength to do this again? And that's an open question, because without German agreement, it is going to be a one-off.
And another big part of the world, one that you reported from many years ago, India. A lot of things happening there as well, including the really spiking of the coronavirus cases, as well as a serious conflict on the borders that you already mentioned before with China, and the reality that India still is a very big player, which with pretty good relationships with the United States and a lot of other countries. At the moment. What's happening in India, and why should we be paying attention to this?
Well, if Pompeo wants to give a follow-up speech about China, I'd suggest Delhi might be a receptive venue at the moment. What happened on the border late last month and early this month, the disputed part of the border up in Ladakh, in the Himalayan China-India border, along the line of actual control, was almost an exact replay of the early moments of the 1962 India-China war, in which China humiliated India, Nehru's India, very, very easily. And it threatened at one point to be escalating back to that kind of situation. And there's no reason to believe the result would have been any different. China is massively more militarily powerful than India. And the stakes there, are minute in terms of the actual if you look at the sort of cartography of it, these are tiny. This is about a larger sort of neuralgia between a rising and more robust China that we're all seeing, and a neighboring India that, that wants to assert its own role in the region. And Modi, in spite of being a nationalist, in spite of being a very pugilistic figure in many respects, as we saw with Pakistan last year before the previous Indian general election, Modi clearly read the sort of odds of this situation and has been tamping it down quite heavily. There is a lot of anti-China feeling in India. People are burning Chinese goods. The Indian government banned, I think it was 59 Chinese apps, including TikTok and WeChat and apps like that, which is it's a largely symbolic move. And the temperature has fallen a little bit now. They have disengaged. But it's very clear that, if China wants to bloody India's nose, it can bloody India's nose. And so I think that lesson's been administered. In terms of the coronavirus situation in India, it's now third, as you mentioned, worldwide in terms of infections, behind Brazil and the United States. Its infection rate is rising more rapidly, but its testing rate is a fraction of even the sort of inadequate testing rates you're seeing in the United States and Brazil. So the supposition, I think, correct, is that it's much, much higher. It's probably the largest. It's probably now the epicenter of coronavirus infections in the world, if it were being measured properly. And that's a huge problem for India. It's not a highly developed economy. It cannot afford fiscally to pay its workforce to stay at home. Modi did a very sort of quick and quite comprehensive lockdown in late March with very, very little warning, and stranded tens of millions of migrant workers in the cities, providing them no means to get home. They then eventually somehow found their way home. It's one of the largest sort of movements of human population in history, sort of second, third only to partition. And they took the infections back to the villages. They had no means of subsistence. And so Modi was forced to undo the lockdown because of the economic pressures. And now, of course, naturally, we're seeing the infection rate take off again. So India's in a pretty awkward place at the moment. It's going to have its first negative growth in 40 years. And it can't really afford it. And on the foreign policy stage, Modi is he's not able to be the strongman that he wants to be. Last point I'll make, though, is he's still got approval ratings of 74%. So in spite of all of this, he's still seen as the strongman. And I think part of the reason why is there is no opposition to speak of. The Congress party is in tatters.
Some countries and leaders are always fortunate and lucky when in their oppositions, and clearly that's the case with Modi today. Carla, you mentioned earlier that not many people have paid attention in the United States, including in the administration, to what was happening on the border. A war between China and India is a big deal, and one would have expected the United States to spend some time and effort on it. Is there any suggestion that the U.S. is involved, other than a singular tweet by the President of the United States? And if not, why not?
There's no diplomacy for this administration. I mean, it's very interesting. At one point, as I recall, they were claiming that they had been invited to negotiate with Pakistan, and the Indians were going, no one invited you to do that. This is an incredibly empty State Department. This is not the State Department we remember, Steve and Ivo and Ed. I mean, this is just unless there are things going on. I mean, Ed is much closer to it than I am. Unless there are things going on, that I haven't detected. No, I mean, could you imagine? I really can't imagine a time in which there would have been something that had the potential, to go so much further. But we have a pandemic in which you don't have American leadership on organizing a global response on the vaccine either. This is the beggar thy neighbor approach to the vaccine. Nobody's looking out for India. Nobody's looking out for the developing world, certainly not from the United States and the US, and the institution that would normally be doing that, the WHO, the US has pulled out of. So I'm not detecting it. Ed, are you detecting it at the State Department?
No.
Yeah, I don't see it.
But it is kind of begs the question, and Steve, jump in here. The George W. Bush administration started a outreach to India, and in fact, the Clinton administration did. Stroke Talbot wrote a wonderful book about it, about India and the importance that the relationship had. It continued in the Bush administration. It continued in the Obama administration. In some ways, it's continued in the Trump administration with two very important Trump-Modi meetings, one in Houston and Texas, and one in India itself. And the logic of the situation, given what's happening with China, would suggest, right, that the United States and presumably other parts of the world would want to be close to India and try to figure out a way to help it in this situation. And yet, when we don't see a lot of it.
That would be the logic of it. If you're trying to create an alliance against China, there's India, right? I'm still angry with Madeleine Albright for cutting short a trip to India that I was on because she had to go chasing some talk with Primakov somewhere, which produced nothing. You know?
Steve, you are dating yourself.
Well, it's true. I mean, you can see, очевидно, you know. But what fascinated me also about this burst with China and India is China was very aggressive. And China immediately quietly started to build things where there hadn't been things built before. Roads and military installations, even up there in this very, very forbidding area. And it's just like the South China Sea. It's these islands on the South China Sea. China is putting down military markers. It's pushing forward. And I mean, I think that's part of what's so really interesting. And so, yes, the logic would be you get India to help. But from what Ed said very sensibly, I think India's really got its own troubles right now. But no, I mean, you know, Bolton gave an interview to Spiegel not very long ago about the book, of course. And one of the things he said, which struck me very much, and I'm sure it's in the book, which is that Trump doesn't have a strategy. He doesn't have a policy. It's just kind of what he thinks that day, right? And everyone runs around either trying to pretend he never said what he said or deflect him from something or somehow try to carry something out without really making it happen. So to ask him, Bolton said, to actually think in a strategic way about anything is basically impossible.
Ed, earlier this week, we finally had the publication in the UK of a major report on Russian interference in Russian activities in Britain, not only on elections, but on financing and so many other things. In some ways a bombshell, because it wasn't really about Russia, it was about how it was enabled in many ways by the British political system.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that. I agree. The key takeaway. I mean, you know, this report was ready 17 months ago. It's the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, House of Commons Committee, all party consensus, no dissenting voices across all parties, from the Scottish Nationalists to the Conservatives. And it looked at Russian interference from the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 through to the most recent British general election in December. It sort of skipped over the Brexit referendum, which, pardon the cliche, is the elephant in the room. But it was produced 17 months ago. And it took a while for them to get the redactions from MI5, MI6, and the other security agencies in Britain. But then when it was due to come out, Boris Johnson said, no, not till after the election. So I think the supposition was there was going to be more of a bombshell there about Russian influence on the referendum in 2016 than there was. So therefore, if this is just about optics, Boris Johnson might have played it quite well. So, well, this is what you were waiting for. But on the other hand, what it details is really quite extraordinary, which is a British system that has had repeated warning signals and incidents and events to do with Russian interference, whether it be connected with the killing of Russian dissidents on British soil or attempted killing of Russian dissidents on British soil, bankrolling of various political initiatives or thinly disguised funding of some of the Brexit campaign, the general climate of complicity amongst Britain's financial elite and real estate elite in London with the Russian oligarchs. The report describes London as a laundromat for Russian money. And therefore, in its detail, the report makes it very clear why we don't know enough about the Russian alleged role in the 2016 referendum, because nobody wanted to investigate it. And it had no evidence. There was no security agency sort of follow up on this. No political priority was put on it. Theresa May's government, before that, David Cameron's for other Russian interferences. Boris Johnson's for sure not interested. So the system, is up to its eyeballs in Russian cash. The whole of the, you look, whether it's prep schools or realtors, or PR agencies that, that launder reputations. London is a merry-go-round of Russian money, and nobody really wants, in senior levels of government, nobody really wants to get to the bottom of it. Maybe this report will change that. And of course, the report's very interesting for other democracies, particularly the United States in the build-up to November, to look at. It's not as comprehensive as the Mueller report, but it adds a lot of the financial piece of things that the Mueller report didn't go into.
I think that's very interesting, Carla, as a piece. I mean, Fiona Hill, when she testified famously on Congress during the impeachment hearing, said that the United States was enabling, because of our divisions, because of the social media climate, allowed sort of Russia to interfere. That it is in fact our own divisions that make it possible. In some ways, that's what the British report is saying too, that we are our own worst enemy, and we're just opening up the system to Russia. Is that the right way to think about this? Or yes, there is a nefarious player on the Russian side too that is exploiting it, but in some ways that it is enabled by our own weaknesses.
Well, we're certainly selling them the rope. There is that quality to it. What's so interesting about the British report to me is that we had our report, certainly a far more limited, the 2017, intelligence community report that came out that was our warning. And what the Trump administration is doing, and whether it comes out in October or September, we are going to have our surprise from the Barr Justice Department that is going to try to dismantle that report step by step. We will be going in the exact opposite direction. We have this, Durham with Barr doing this report, and they are going to try to claim that, that the CIA and Obama appointees tried to bully the NSA and other parts of the intelligence community into claiming that, Putin was supporting Trump. They're trying to, that the FBI was persecuting people in the Trump. They are going to try to fundamentally undermine all of the things that are in the UK report. Now we have not done, they have not looked at the support for think tanks. They haven't looked at the support for education. They haven't looked at the civil society aspect of it, which is a really important thing and that needs to be looked at. There's no question about it. But the most basic thing, the thing about which there is no question at all in anybody's mind in the intelligence community, is being systematically undermined by the US Justice Department. And, stay tuned for that. So it will be interesting to see whether the Brits go further to understand it and start questioning themselves about it, while we're going in the other direction and undermining it right before the election.
Steve, we have about a minute left. Now the UK and the United States have done deep investigations in Russian nefarious activities. The same is happening all over Europe, from France and Italy to Germany and other parts. What is happening in Europe in terms of looking at these kinds of issues?
Well, there's a lot of looking into disinformation. I mean, I was in Britain for both referendums and actually covered them. And the Brexit one was close enough. What we haven't really talked about, which I'm sure is in the report somewhere, there's a huge amount of social media manipulation, some, mostly in local languages, but you saw it in the Scottish referendum to some degree, and you certainly saw it in the Brexit referendum, where RT, which is the most open Kremlin, was basically pushing for Brexit and pushing for Scottish independence. So the Russian position couldn't have been clearer. And then you also see a lot of anxiety in Europe that it not be used the way the London courts are used for Russians to manipulate their oligarchs and get money out of them. I mean, there's this whole argument that, Putin is kind of running this huge black slush fund of that is everywhere, and a lot of it is in Britain, and this is money that gets used for all kinds of different purposes. So there is an anxiety, particularly in the European Union, because in the East, in candidate countries and places like Serbia, but also in member states like Hungary, Russians are very active. They're very active in trying to press on divisive issues and pull the European Union apart.
We covered a lot. We didn't cover everything we wanted to cover, but then we can come back next week. Steve Erlanger, Ed Luce, Carla and Robbins, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, all of you. If you want to listen to this again, you can do so on our YouTube channel and various social media channels. Thanks all for joining, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Ivo. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks to all. Stay healthy.